All right, we have talked about biodiversity, and it's been kind of a forced march over the past couple of lectures. I've talked about prokaryotes, which include archaea and bacteria, and then for our purposes, 4 kingdoms of eukaryotes, animals and plants, fungi, and then kind of a catch-all term for every eukaryote that isn't an animal, plant, or fungus, which we call protists. And I've said all I've really got time to about biodiversity of the living, but we have to add an important aspect of biological diversity, which is, of course, biodiversity of the not living. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay, so I've said all I can about living biodiversity, but in terms of rocks that we call sedimentary, lucky, dig up rocks that look, or sometimes footprints, or sometimes coral reefs. Sometimes if you're extremely lucky and digging in exactly the right spot, you can dig up things like Tyrannosaurus Rex skeletons, right? Like the one that you should and needs to be let in. And I'm sorry, every time the switch, I heard a. Okay, sorry, that was your comment, and I was just really slow to get to it for some reason. My system is acting a little bit slow. Okay, since I will assume everybody can see what we're talking about, we shall march onward. And yeah, if you are lucky enough to dig in exactly the right parts of South Dakota, you can end up excavating things like complete T-Rex skeletons. This particular one is the one on view at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. This is one that was unearthed back in the 90s. I don't. Okay, something that you age range one way or the other on what can and can't be a fossil. Some dead seashells that you pick up on a beach are fossils, albeit not particularly old ones. The snail that made them, might have died yesterday, but they still count. And fossils can include both body fossils and trace fossils. Body fossils are any remains of an actual organism's body. Sometimes they can be very well preserved, like up there, that is a fossil fish, actually fairly closely related to bluegills, from a location up in Wyoming that's now preserved as Fossil Beds National Monument. Well worth a visit if you're ever up close to the town of Kemmerer, Wyoming. That's a body fossil because it's clearly the skeleton, and even that discoloration is stains left over from the soft tissue of an ancient fish. Most body fossils don't look that good. You might only get a few teeth or a scrap of bone or a fragment of shell or something like that. But what makes them all body fossils is the fact that they are some kind of trace of an actual body. The other major type of fossils are called trace fossils. The picture that you see down there below is a picture that I took at a really cool place that is in the middle of absolute nowhere in the northeast corner of New Mexico at a spot called Clayton Lake State Park. They made an artificial lake. To make it, they had to build a dam. To build the dam, they had to dig up a bunch of soil, and when they did that and uncovered rocks underneath, it turned out to be very rich in footprints. And down in the lower middle of that lower picture, you can see there's a dent in the rock. It's in shadow, so it looks really dark. And it looks vaguely triangle shaped. And if you look carefully, you can see it's got 3 points on it, almost like an arrowhead. What that is a dinosaur footprint. And if you look ahead of it, you can actually see a second dinosaur footprint in line with it. The cool thing about Clayton Lake State Park is that it's a very good place to see not just footprints, but what we call trackways, entire series of footprints left by a walking individual. And if I didn't say it, these are dinosaur footprints. Probably the most familiar and maybe most spectacular example of trace fossils, but we have trace fossils of worms and centipedes and things like that as well. Lots of things make trace fossils. And yeah, so any trace of any living thing that used to be there and now isn't is a fossil. If you want to get fancy about it, if you were on campus and you poked around outside the student center, you'd find some blocks of cement in the sidewalk that had leaves fall on them before the concrete had hardened. And so now there's these impressions of leaves preserved in the surface of the concrete blocks that make up one of the walks. Those are fossils. That counts. That leaf used to be there and now isn't, but it's left a trace, and that trace might last for, I don't know how long. Okay. Virtually all the rocks where you could find fossils are what we call sedimentary rocks. I'm not going to say much about rock types. You might know that there are other types of rocks. Rocks that used to be so hot they were liquid are known as igneous rocks, rocks made by cooling lava or things like that. And rocks that have been transformed in their structure and chemistry by being heated and squeezed are called metamorphic rocks. But just about all of Arkansas you've got sedimentary rocks, at least on the surface under the soil. They're not quite as spectacular, perhaps, as this picture, which shows you one side of the Grand Canyon. But just about everything you're going to see in this state, other than a little patch of igneous rock just south of Little Rock, that's actually, there's a quarry for it right at about I think it's the State Highway 365 exit. It's just past the interchange on 167. Other than that, and things like Crater of Diamonds, just about everything else you're going to see in Arkansas is sedimentary rock. The Ozarks are made almost entirely of sedimentary rocks, and so are the Ouachitas. What that means is that sedimentary rocks are formed by usually water or sometimes air picking up particles of mud, silt, or sand and then dumping them somewhere. So if you wanted to see this process happening today, you could go to the mouth of a river, like say the Mississippi River, which erodes tiny particles, mud and silt and things like that from, half the continent, transports them into the Gulf of Mexico and deposits them on the bottom of the ocean. And this process is going on even as we speak. Other types of sedimentary rock might be laid down not as little particles, but by evaporation or some kind of chemical reactions. Limestone is an example of a sedimentary rock that's laid down by chemistry. There's a type of limestone called travertine that you can see if you go into just about any hardware store because it's popular for tiles. I've actually got some in my house. That's a type of rock that's laid down by chemical reactions taking place in hot water. Layers of rock salt, the kind of thing that they mine down in South Louisiana, are sedimentary rocks laid down when salt water evaporates. But if it's laid down by water or air at a relatively cool temperature, you've got a sedimentary rock. And sedimentary rocks are very typically laid down in layers of various thickness. If you look at this picture of the Grand Canyon, you can see all those horizontal lines seeming to divide up the rocks. Some of them are very narrow. Some of them are a lot wider. That's very typical of sedimentary rock deposits. All right. We're going to go back in time and do, the Scooby-Doo thing to Denmark in the 1600s and the career of this guy, a man by the name of Nicholas Steno. For the record, the only thing I would expect you to remember about Steno specifically is his last name and some idea of where he comes in history. You don't have to memorize his birth dates or death date. You don't even have to know his first name. You don't have to know that he was trained as a physician, but converted to Roman Catholicism, became a priest, spent half of his life doing missionary work in Europe at a time when that was dangerous, because this was the time when Europeans were killing each other over what religion they were supposed to belong to. This is the time of religious wars. You don't have to know that he was beatified in 1987. That's one step below sainthood in the Roman Catholic Church. What you got to know is what he did as a scientist. And he was one of the first persons to try to think about how fossils form. It's all very well to, go digging in, let's say, some parts of the Ozarks and dig up little seashells or something like that. But it's another thing to try to figure out how they got there. How do you get a seashell into a solid rock? And where did the solid rock come from in the first place? Well, he did some thinking, and he came up with a couple of principles that geologists still use. And if you're wondering about practical applications of this, remember that not only are there a number of, solid rock resources that come from sedimentary rocks, everything from certain metals to products like sand and gravel and things like that. The other thing that comes out of sedimentary rock layers is petroleum and natural gas. And people who go drilling for those use Steno's principles all the time. And he came up with several, but the one we're going to focus on here is sometimes called Steno's law of superposition. This is a scene in South Utah at a site called the Vermilion Cliffs. These are also sedimentary rocks. If you look up about halfway up, you can start seeing the banding, the striped patterns that are very typical of sedimentary rock layers. These were all laid down, some of them by water and actually some of them by wind. This area used to have a lot of sand dunes in it. So they're all sedimentary. And Steno reasoned that if you had a stack of layers, the ones on the bottom of your stack had to be the oldest in the stack. And then as you went up the stack, you went through progressively younger and younger rocks until the youngest ones in the stack had to be the ones at the top. Think about a really messy desk. Maybe some of you have a desk like this, right? You put a layer of papers on your desk. Maybe it's unpaid bills or past due homework assignments or something like that. If you don't clean it, you'll end up covering the older papers with a newer layer of papers as time goes by, right? And then if you don't clean it, you'll end up with newer papers still on top of the older ones until you end up with a complete mess where you have the newest papers, the newest, past due homework assignments and the newest unpaid bills and the newest letters from your mom that you never got around to answering are going to be on the top of the big pile of papers on your desk. And then underneath that, you will have, unpaid bills and important letters from the previous month. And then under that, you'll have a layer of unpaid bills and things from the month before that, and so on, maybe going down quite deeply, right? Because when you get papers and you pile them on your desk intending to deal with them later and never getting around to it, you always tend to put them on the top. So you're going to end up with the most recent papers on the top of your great big pile and the older papers on the bottom of your pile, unless you do something crazy like actually try to clean up or sort through your pile of papers. It works the same way here. Instead of having, instead of having those, you're not going to have the rocks on the top form first and then rocks on the bottom magically appear underneath the older rocks. That would be kind of like, putting the frosting on the cake, putting a layer of frosting down and then trying to slip the cake underneath it, right? It doesn't really work that way. What happens is that if you have layers of sand getting dumped in a place by water or air, it starts at the bottom and builds. Like, okay, let's say you had a bathtub and you had a bucket of sand. You fill the bathtub with water and you pour the sand in. Well, the sand is going to settle to the bottom. Then let's say you have a bucket of mud and you pour that in. The mud will settle on top of the sand. And then let's say you have a bucket of pebbles and you pour that in. The pebbles are going to settle on top of the mud, on top of the sand, and so on. So that stack is built from the bottom up. By the way, Steno's law doesn't say a thing about how old rock layers are. That's not what it's there for. Just to give you an example, these are two places that I got to visit in my traveling years. On the left, that's a scene in a place called the Drum Mountains in the middle of absolute nowhere in western Utah. There are interesting fossils there, but there's no particular reason you would have heard of it, except for the fact that those rock layers, we reckon, formed roughly 500 million years ago and took several million years to form. How we get those numbers, I'll talk about in just a bit. On the other hand, the scene on the right, there's also rock layers. Those are laid down on the rim of an extinct volcano called Ubehebe Crater in Death Valley National Park, California. You could drive up the slopes of the volcano and stand on the rim of the crater if you were so minded, as I have done. And if you look, starting on the left-hand side, you can see some finely banded gray and black layers of rock on the rim of the crater. Those formed just a few thousand years ago. We know there were people around. There were Native Americans living in the area, and it probably only took a few weeks for those layers to form. So on the rim of Ubehebe crater, you've got young rocks. I mean, not young compared to a human lifespan, but young compared to human history. You know, rocks that might have formed probably younger than the pyramids of Egypt. On the left, you've got rocks that formed unimaginably long ago and took a ridiculously long span of time to form. Steno's law doesn't say anything about those ages. Steno's law just says whatever layer is on the base is the oldest, is the first one that formed, and whatever layers are on the top are the youngest. They were the last ones to form. And first and last is relative. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about 500 million years ago or 2,000 years ago. It's only a statement of relative age. You can get this messed up because rock layers can be subject to twisting and breaking and faulting, the kind of thing that happens in earthquakes, and tipping and things like that as a result of sometimes volcanic activity and sometimes the kinds of forces that build mountain ranges. We don't really need to get into what those are. This is a neat example. These are some rock layers that have been squished and crumpled into a kind of zigzag shape, kind of like a beer can against my grandmother's forehead. And usually it's fairly straightforward to recognize when this has happened. If you look for the people in the picture, you can see the rock layers appear to be standing straight up, and then they kind of loop up and then come down. There's this big downwards fold in them, and then they come back up again by the time you get to the right-hand side of the picture. And you could go see that for yourself. That's actually exposed on McLeod Street, somewhere south of Hot Springs, Arkansas. For that matter, you wouldn't have to go as far as Hot Springs. The best place in town to see this is probably driving through that hill on Hogan Road. You know where Hogan is? It's over on the kind of the west boundary of Conway. And if you drive down it towards Highway 64, right, like you're going to Plummerville, as you do, you know, you would drive past what, a bunch of the new post office, or the newer post office. It's not really new now. It seems new to me, but I've been here a while. You would go past that, and then you would go past some restaurants and things, and then you would go past those ginormous apartment complexes, and then you kind of go up and over a hill, and then when at the foot of the hill you hit Highway 64. When you're going over that hill, you can see where the highway was blasted through a big ridge that is more or less the northern edge of Conway. It's called Cadron Ridge. And where the highway was blasted through the ridge, you can see lots of sedimentary rock layers, and they're all standing at about a 50-degree angle. They're not horizontal. They've been tipped. And that's an example of sedimentary rock layers that have been tipped and folded, which in fact is true of just about all of the bedrock between B Branch and Y City. B Branch and Mena. You'll see folds and things like that. Usually it's pretty straightforward to recognize when that's happened. For our purposes, we don't need to get into what could take rock layers that are many miles wide and crumple them. If you really want the answer, you can go look up something called plate tectonics, which is really cool, but we're not going to have time for it. But there are things that can throw off Steno's laws, but usually we can tell. when they've happened. That's the point of the whole thing. Okay, next in the endless parade of dead white dudes. By the way, as soon as I can, I will bring in some people who are dead, but neither white nor dudes, as I have opportunity. At the time in history that we've been talking about so far, at least in the West, it was pretty much only men that were really allowed to do science. Fortunately, that situation's changed, and we'll come to that later. For right now, I want to introduce you to William Smith. Not the guy who got famous as the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. This is a different William Smith. He was apprenticed as a teenager to a surveyor and ended up becoming pretty much what we now call a civil engineer, and did a lot of work during the early days of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Hopefully you had enough European history in your background that you know what that was. He worked for mining companies, worked in coal mines, developing ways to engineer the mine for safety and efficiency. He did a lot of work on surveying canals, which were, at the time, before railroads became a big thing, canals were the preferred way to ship large quantities of stuff, right? If you had a factory, the cheapest way to get all of the coal and iron that you might need was to ship it on barges. And that might also be the cheapest way to get whatever your factory was producing down to, wherever you were going to sell it. It's cheaper to go by water than having to build roads or anything like that. And so England was, and still is, crisscrossed by this network of canals, albeit these days they're mostly used for recreation. You can go, take tours on the canals or things like that. If you know your American history, you might know that there were similar things being done in the United States at the time. You might have heard of the Erie Canal, for example. Anyway, because Smith is working in mines and working on canal digging, he gets to see more of the rocks under the surface of the earth than anybody else. Most places on the earth, the rock layers tend to get covered up by soil and plants and all these annoying things. And it's not easy to see the rock layers when they're covered up like that. But Smith uncovered an awful lot of rocks because he was helping dig canals and mines. And he started collecting fossils from sedimentary rock layers. What he realized is that you don't find any old fossil just anywhere. First of all, in any one area, different rock layers contained different fossils. More to the point, fossils always occurred in a predictable order of appearance. If you found fossil A in one set of rock layers, and then in the rock layers above that, and so younger than it, you found fossil B, then you would find fossil A in lower layers and B in upper layers anywhere you went, all over England. If you found A and B, A would always be older than B. So you could work out this order of appearance of fossils and then use that to predict what you could find, even if you were digging in a place that you'd never dug before. This is sometimes called Smith's law of succession. It's not really a scientific law, but it's a principle that's still very much in use. And I'll give you an example, and then tomorrow's lab, you're actually going to see another example. This is just a diagram, but it represents places that I used to visit a lot back in my traveling days. On the left, that's a diagram of rock layers that you would see if you poked around enough in a bunch of mountain ranges in southern Nevada and eastern California. This is what the rock stack would look like. At the bottom of the stack, you have layers of actually lots of different things, but pretty thick sandstones and siltstones called the Wood Canyon Formation. And by the way, formation in this context only means a distinctive rock layer. It doesn't actually have to look like anything. You know, you might use formation to mean, you know, that cliff that looks like the profile of Bill Clinton or something like that. But when geologists talk about a rock formation, what they mean is just a distinctive layer. And rock layers are named after places where they are studied. So the Wood Canyon Formation is named after a place called Wood Canyon in the Spring Mountain Range outside of Las Vegas. Anyway, so at the bottom of the stack, you have a set of rock layers we call the Wood Canyon Formation. On top of that stack, there's a layer of a rock type called quartzite, and it happens to be called the Zabriskie quartzite. That's the name of a ghost town, Zabriskie. On top of that, you have a layer of very fine, there's several things in there, but a lot of it is very thin, crumbly rock called shale. And we call that the Carrara Formation. Again, that's named after an old ghost town that's out that way. It's named for the place where the rocks were studied. And on top of that, you have a big layer of gray, hard, very thick, shred the hell out of your pants. Don't ask me how I know that. Rock called dolomite. Not the comedian. Dolomite is like limestone with extra magnesium thrown in. And we call that layer the Bonanza King dolomite. Bonanza King was the name of a mine around here. So this is what you would see in an awful lot of mountain ranges in southeast California and southern Nevada. The Wood Canyon Formation is the oldest, and the Bonanza King dolomite is the youngest, and the others are in between. And if you go digging in the Wood Canyon Formation, you'll find remains of a critter called a trilobite. Trilobites have lots of segments. They had lots of legs. They are extinct. We don't have them anymore. That's what they look like. If you saw one, you might think it was a crab or something like that. The last of them died out a long time ago. But if you go digging in the right layers in the Wood Canyon Formation, you'll find trilobites belonging to a genus called Nevadia. If you go digging in the Carrara, there's not a whole lot you can find in the Zabriskie, but if you go digging in the lower layers of the Carrara, you'll find a different trilobite called Olanellus, which admittedly looks a lot like Nevadia, but they're not the same, and with a little practice, you can learn how to tell them apart. It's not rocket surgery telling them apart. There's plenty of amateur collectors that come out and study these trilobites. And then if you dig in the top layers of the Carrara Formation, you'll find a different type of trilobite in the genus Cispocephalus. Why the hell does this matter? Come on, Wagner, get to the point. Well, the reason it matters is that this is not the only place in North America you could find these trilobites. They've been found up in British Columbia. They've turned up in Siberia. They've turned up in parts of Newfoundland on the Atlantic coast of Canada. They've turned up in parts of Georgia, of all places. They turned up in, I want to say Spain. I could be wrong about Spain, but they've turned up in locations all around the world. And if you find them at all, you find them in this order of appearance. You always find Nevadia in rocks that are older than the ones where you find Olanellus. And you always find Olanellus in rocks that are older than the ones in which you find Cispocephalus. Now, mind you, in lots of places you don't find these at all. You find completely different fossils. You're not going to find any of these in rocks on the surface of Arkansas, for example. But if you find them, they always appear in that order. And people have been testing that, people including me, by going out and digging and building up collections like this, not just people who think fossils are cool. Geologists working for government groups and industry have gone and done this and confirmed this over and over. If you find these fossils in North America, you find them in that time order. Sometimes, by the way, this can be very useful for trying to find oil, because the rocks that are brought to the surface in the drilling of an oil well contain fossils, and the fossils that they contain in them can sometimes be very important tools to tell you how far down you've drilled and how much further or in what direction you might have to go in order to hit a rock layer that's likely to have oil or gas. One of the few fossil scientists who died wealthy was the guy who worked out how to do that and sold his knowledge to the oil industry, a guy named Joseph Cushman about 100 years ago. Okay, right. That's the way that Smith's law of superposition works. And what that lets you do is define time periods. This lets you use fossils to tell time. And you tell time based on what living things were alive. For example, you might have heard of the age of dinosaurs. Those are, we know about this because we have rocks that were laid down during a particular time in Earth history that have fossils of, among other things, dinosaurs. And you probably have learned that the dinosaurs went extinct 65 odd million years ago. And after that time, large mammals become the dominant land animals as they are today, elephants and rhinos and critters like that. So we can define a period of Earth history when you find lots of bones of dinosaurs and critters like that. And then after that, a period in history where you don't find dinosaurs and you start finding progressively larger mammals. I'm simplifying it quite a bit, but this is basically how it works. If we go back to that previous slide, we could say, okay, there must have been a time period in Earth history when Nevadia was crawling around in the ocean floor. We'd actually call that the Nevadia zone, technically. And then after that, there must have been a time when Olanellus was crawling around on the ocean floor. And then after that, there must have been a time when Cispocephalus was crawling around on the ocean floor. So we can use these fossils as markers of time periods. I'm simplifying a bit, but this is what I've just described with the age of dinosaurs. And we can divide the age of dinosaurs further based on what specific types of dinosaurs and other critters were running around at the time. You might know that we divide this time into subdivisions called the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous. Don't know if you grew up crazy about dinosaurs. Some of you probably did. So we use fossils as markers of time. And by about 1850, this was pretty much uncontroversial. This, by the way, is what you can see if you ever get to visit Dinosaur National Park outside the bustling metropolis of Vernal, Utah. Very much worth a visit. And the message that's become clear, and was clear by about 1850, is that life has a history. There used to be living things that are not like the ones we have now, and they have disappeared and been replaced by other living things, and so on. There's been a very long series of different species of animals, plants, and everything else existing for a while and then going extinct and getting replaced by something else. What causes that we'll look at in a bit, but for right this minute, we don't have to know what the cause is. All you need to know at the moment is that life on Earth has history. Probably it was a very long history. Nobody in 1850 knew how long, but long. And you can't fully understand life as it is today unless you know something about its history. You know, for the same reason that you can't understand the United States today without understanding something about its history. You know, you can't understand things like, you know, why race relations are kind of screwed up in this country unless you know something about the history of slavery and Jim Crow and the Klan and things like that. That's a history that is still being played out today, for better or for worse. The same thing is true of life. You can't fully understand why life on Earth is the way it is without understanding it as a historical process. Life is the way it is because it got to be that way. It came about to become that way. Okay, that was starting to sound downright grandiose and philosophical. I'm going to go ahead and pause the presentation here. I've got 9:52. Let's reconvene at 10:05. Sorry, I'm messing with Windows right there. So I will pause the presentation and I will stop recording.